How about
All right. We can check that.
a Seattle writer and a Eugene writer? So our Seattle writer is Matt Briggs. He's the author of 8 works of fiction, including The Remains of River Names and The Strong Man. His novel Shoot the Buffalo was a finalist for the Washington State Book Award and was awarded an American Book Award by the Before Columbus Foundation in 2006. His recent work has appeared in Opium Magazine, Monkey Bicycle, the Chicago Review, and the Billings Gazette. Publication Studio recently published 2 of his works, his novel The Double E and a collection of short stories, Virility Rituals of North American Teenage Boys. And you can find him online at finalstatepress.com/Matt Briggs. Matt Briggs.
Thanks, Margaret, and thanks, Howard, for organizing this reading. I appreciate that. And Tsunami Books, I read at Tsunami Books 10 years ago, I think, from my second book called Misplaced Alice, published by Stringtown Press. And it is really a big relief to see that this bookstore is essentially the same. So many bookstores that I've read at over the last 10 years don't exist anymore. In fact, the last time I read at Jackson's Books in Salem, there was nobody there, not even the owner of the store. It was empty. It was kind of creepy. I didn't actually read because there was nobody. I mean, sometimes I'll do that, you know, but and then they close shortly thereafter. I hope that we're through the sort of like massive kill-off as a result. I mean, if Borders is going out of business, Barnes & Noble apparently is in trouble, and a bookstore like this is a physical space that has endured, and I hope continues to endure. The books are on the shelves. You can go and look at them. My own writing practice has become increasingly digital, so I have physical books, and I feel fortunate to be working with a press in Portland called Publication Studio, which really focuses both on the digital but also the physical aspects of the book. So I brought my books. I have The Double E, which is my new novel, which is kind of a depressing book, and then a more joyful book called Virility Rituals, which is a collection of short stories. Not a manual or a handbook. And here's a copy of the Publication Studio version of the book. It was printed. They print the books themselves right in the store. So there's two people who work at the store in Portland. And when they print the book, they bind it right in the store and print a date on the side, which shows you the actual moment that it was manufactured. And it's embossed with the Publication Studio mark on the side, and it's printed with a kind of reappropriated manila envelope. And this one is a kind of a blood red color, and you can see the inside marking. So it's a very physical book, and I'm really happy to have this book in this physical space and be able to read to you. So tonight I'm going to read a story about Theodore Roethke, who is a Seattle poet. He appears kind of in the story. He's kind of the Seattle poet, and he's not from Seattle, which really irritates me a lot. He's not even from the Pacific Northwest. He's from Minnesota. He writes about Minnesota, except for his last couple of poems, and yet he is sort of indelibly marked as a Pacific Northwest poet. Primarily, I guess, because he taught at the University of Washington, and he brought an actual Pacific Northwest poet, even though he's from Indiana and wrote about Indiana, ended up writing a lot about the Pacific Northwest. David Wagner, who now is quite old, but has written a large body of work that I would say is Pacific Northwestern. And also, in turn, has taught a lot of people. I was a student of David Wagner and kind of feel happy to have this sort of weird connection back to the non-Pacific Northwest poet, Theodore Roethke. And I kind of feel like Roethke, it represents sort of the Seattle root of Pacific Northwest poetry, having taught both David Wagner and then bringing David Wagner to the Pacific Northwest, having taught Tess Gallagher, who's a poet from Port Angeles in Washington State, and a poet that's a lot closer to me, Richard Hugo, who ended up teaching at the University of Montana for many years. And the sort of corresponding Oregon, I think, writers who kind of are in that group would be, William Stafford. And then a kind of weird outlier who would be Ken Kesey, who I think kind of belongs to that generation. Kesey is not part, Rethke is almost like, to me, a complete opposite version of Kesey. Kesey does not belong to the establishment, happened to have a teaching job, and to my understanding, I never had a class with him, or I've talked to people, read memoirs about people who've had classes with him. It was not exactly conventional in the same way that Rethke was. Rethke was tied to the Eastern establishment, and I'm glad to sort of dovetail the story I'm going to read with what John read with the Watchtower, where Jack Kerouac worked, and then also some of the Watchtower references that are in Gary Snyder's work, who's also a Pacific Northwest poet. So hopefully this will round out our Pacific Northwest evening with a little bit of prose related to it. So this is from the point of view of a girl, a woman, who's probably 18 or 19. I'm not that. So you'll have to imagine. And it's called the Penile Colony. My first father worked as a mechanic on airplanes, but he couldn't fix his own car, a 1939 Pontiac with second-hand wheels with wooden spokes. It had wheels like a Conestoga. He enforced his rules with a swift smack to my back. My second father worked in a bank and came home after 6, tired. He took off his jacket and lay on the couch where he snoozed until dinner. After dinner, he had a glass of sweet wine that was as thick as molasses and the color of cola. That improved his mood for about half an hour so I could stand him. We played a game of chess. He always won except for our last game. I started to study chess books and learn chess traps. We sat down to play, and within 10 minutes I had him. Checkmate, I said. Checkmate? He repeated back to me. He sat looking at the board for a long time. Well, he finally said, that settles that. We didn't play chess anymore. He never told me his rules, but I knew them. My third father designed control panels for submarines. He talked with a slow country drawl and always wore a felt hat. When it rained, which it always did in those days, the hat turned funny colors and all splotchy like a giraffe's neck. He used to tickle me until the insides of my ribcage felt bruised. The muscles of my belly twitched. He hooked a finger when I was paralyzed with laughter under my bra and peeled it back so that the cups squashed my boobs. He acted like he didn't know what he was doing. When I squirmed away from him, he would walk slowly after me, calling me out in his country drawl. And during his regime, I lived through an uneasy lawlessness. After Mom married my fifth father, I asked her, why do you marry every man you meet? It was getting so that every loony psychopath and social misfit got wind of her divorce and lined up. I'm in love, she said. This is her answer for everything. When she started to get ready to kick me out, she told me she loved me. Love for her was the beginning and end of the story. I figured by my fifth dad that for Mom it was easier to find a man than find a job. This father came with his own set of rules. He wrote on an old piece of cardboard he secretly nailed to the back of the garage door where I wouldn't see it until I broke one. After Thanksgiving, in the early days of the 1960 Christmas shopping season, when the stores were just getting decorated and the Salvation Army Santas had just set up buckets on the sidewalks, Mom kicked me out of the house. She said if I couldn't follow the rules of the house, I could figure out how they worked on the street. She might have thought that after a few days I would return home contrary and eager to do as I was told. Problem was, I was always eager to do what I was told. I just had trouble figuring it out. I took my bag and went downtown and rented a locker at the Greyhound bus station. When sleep arrived, it didn't matter that my body wasn't lying in perfect repose and freshly laundered sheets with soft pillows. I slept most of my life in sheets and a mattress in a room with a door and the familiar shadows of stuffed animals, my chest of drawers, the faint odor of my mother's dinner lingering in the house. She boiled meat. On the huge wooden benches at the bus station, I approximated sitting, lolling until my head curled into the embrace of the wood warmed by the scalps of countless passengers waiting for their cross-country buses. At home, sleep rolled out through the night, and I would reluctantly wake in the sheet staring at the morning light streaked across the ceiling of my room. In the bus station, I woke throughout the night to check the area around me to make sure some pervert or drunken sailor hadn't sidled up to me. My neck kinked as I came to at some early morning of the hour to find a sailor in his whites sitting a respectable distance on the bench next to me. He had his hat over his privates, and the hat danced up and down. I stood suddenly, pain flaring in my back and my sleeping legs, and I grabbed my coat. I staggered into the middle of the bus station. No one else was awake at that hour. The sailor watched me move. He wasn't an ugly man or even plain, but somewhat handsome. His face was flushed from whatever he had been doing to himself. He adjusted himself. He had bothered me, but at least I figured the sailor was honest about what he needed and how he would get it. He was actually looking at me, but once I was awake, he swept himself up and leaned on the bench for support and disappeared out the door into the cool middle of the night. I was awake, but aware of the fuzzy feeling in my neck and the back of my knees. I still needed sleep for school. In a few hours, I returned to my spot and returned to my troubled slumber. I adjusted myself, and when the pain of sleeping in a natural position became too much, I showered at the YMCA and then caught the bus to school. In the evening, I returned to Seattle. I sometimes stayed at school for as long as possible because I didn't have anything to do. I hung out in the art room and drew pictures. The art teacher and sometimes my English teacher drank coffee together and commented on my drawings. I listened carefully in order to follow their instructions. My English teacher said his wife was an artist. At 4 o'clock, I bought a cup of soup in the diner and drank a cup of coffee and did my homework, and then finally I napped on the bus. After 2 weeks, I let it drop I was sleeping in the bus depot, and one of my friends offered for me to stay at her house. When I moved in, it became clear she wanted company in everything she did. She wanted me to follow her around. If she was reading a book, she wanted me to turn the pages. One night, I told her I would have some coffee with some friends. She got her coat. I'm going by myself, I said. You mean without me? She asked. I'll be back, I said. You mean I'm not invited? I need some time alone, I said. You mean away from me? We can have coffee together tomorrow night, I said. In the morning, she wouldn't talk to me. I didn't want to go back to her house after school. I did my routine of going to the art room and drawing and killing time. And finally, I went back to her house. It was a week until Christmas. It was raining. They had a Christmas tree. Her parents sat under quilts in the living room watching a program and drinking hot chocolate. Hey, Marge, they said. My friend kicked me out. She had packed my bag. It was getting old anyway, she said. I ended up at my English teacher's house in a deal where I would watch their kids so he and his wife could live in an approximation of their life before they had a kid. They were beatniks. Jim had a tiny little patch of beard on his chin. Ava wore striped t-shirts and cardigans. They both read books and listened to jazz. Their house was small but lined with shelves. I had a room in the basement next to the laundry room. The other room had a cement floor and was used as a kind of workroom and studio where Eva painted. At first it was a good situation because I would look after their kids. He was always asleep when they went out. I would have the run of the house. They didn't own a TV, but they had a ton of books and magazines. I read and drank a glass of wine. They returned late in the evening and sat down to eat something before going to bed. They became closer during those nights out at the jazz clubs in Seattle or the Blue Moon Tavern in Seattle, where they visited some of Jim's old college buddies and sometimes went to parties near the University of Washington campus. It was from Jim and Eva that I learned about Rethke, the greatest poet of the Pacific Northwest. Jim had taken a class from him. 3 months, and he told me everything I need to know, Jim said more than once. He referred to his teacher by his last name, not Professor Rethke or Theodore Rethke, but just Rethke. Still drunk, even after the drive back from Seattle, Jim slurred his way through all of Rethke's poem, The Lost Son. I had to watch him read it. I stood to say goodnight, and Jim stopped reading and asked, "Where are you going?" So I sat down, and he kept on. The shape of a rat? It's bigger than that. It's less than a leg and more than a nose. Just under the water it usually goes. We were at a party with Rethke, Jim said. He was as drunk as everyone else. In fact, he was drunker than everyone else except for the guy who was passed out on the lawn. I had applied to the University of Washington. My art teacher and Jim wrote me letters of recommendation. I suppose it would have been possible to enroll in Rethke's class. Maybe Rethke could tell me what to do because although everyone else seemed intent on it, their instructions weren't giving me a clue. Jim talked sometimes about the artists Kenneth Callahan, Guy Anderson, and Morris Graves. Ava, in turn, talked admiringly about an artist who had lived in Vancouver, Emily Carr. But for these artists who had grown up in places like Edmonds, although they admired them, they also had contempt for their origins. Jim figured they fooled people into considering them great artists. They were all right, but Rethke, however, didn't come from anywhere around here. He had ascended from somewhere else, a cloud island drifting over Ireland, crowded with a hodgepodge of poets, a veritable anthology of English verse, Dylan Thomas, Keats, T.S. Eliot, and so on. Toward Rethke, there wasn't any jealousy, just reverence. Through January and February that year, I thought I was the luckiest girl in school because I had escaped from my parents' house, and I had escaped from the street, and I was living with a writer and his artist wife, and this seemed like a perfect combination to me, and I looked after their peaceful one-year-old. But gradually, Eva became suspicious of me. I'm not sure how it started. She began to give me more chores. At first, she liked me to be downstairs watching after the baby while she painted. Jim was upstairs grading papers, and I was downstairs drawing and painting and verifying that their kid didn't kill himself. Eventually, Eva said she needed to do her work in peace. So I took the baby out in the stroller and visited the river. I tried very carefully to do exactly as she said. I was accepted to the university that autumn with a scholarship and a grant. That night, we had a big dinner in my honor and numerous bottles of wine. Jim became very drunk and suggested that after the baby went to sleep, let's all get naked. Tipsy herself, Eva just giggled. I went to lay the baby down and was wondering what he meant. Let's all get naked. When I returned upstairs, Jim and Eva had gone into the bedroom. The door was ajar and I could hear them. I couldn't tell whether I should go in there as well, so I sat on the couch. They finally came out. They played Mingus while I picked up the dishes and washed them, and then I sat on the floor and drank a glass of wine. Eva looked at me. "Congratulations, honey," she said. "Thanks," I said. I was happy again, and I didn't think about the weird incident again until a couple of nights later, when I came home and Eva and the baby were gone, and it was just Jim and me in the house. "She finally left us alone," he said. "Where is she?" I asked. "She's at her mother's house. Her father isn't doing well and needs help." "Shouldn't you be with them?" "I have papers to grade." "Shouldn't you be grading them?" "I graded them already," he said. "After 3 years of reading those papers, I've already read everything those kids are capable of writing." "What does that mean?" I asked. "Personal essays," he said. "Individual expression is fine, but 17-year-olds aren't individuals." "Is that how you feel about me?" "I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the students in the class where I work." When he said this, I thought he was giving me a pass. I thought maybe I was no longer just one of those students in the class where he worked. He got out a bottle of wine and he put on Mingus. We ate cheese and slices of ham for dinner and oranges for dessert. After we finished the bottle of wine, he opened another. I kissed him because he wanted me to kiss him. I hadn't thought about boys one way or the other the entire year, being more concerned with where I was going to sleep. We were on the couch drinking wine and kissing, and pretty soon I was folded up under him and had to pee. I wanted him to stop, but I didn't want to be rude. I had never done this before, and then I started to cry when I realized what had happened and that I still had to pee. I jumped up and went to the bathroom and half expected blood or something, but there wasn't anything I wouldn't expect. When I came back, he was saying, even before I got there, it's okay, it's okay. We sat on the couch listening to the record. It came to the end, the needle lifted and ratcheted into its slot. "You make sure to brush your teeth," he said. When I woke, Eva was back and so was the baby. I could hear the baby crying. I went upstairs, drank cold coffee still in the pot, and dressed for school. School had lost its importance. The kids there were obsessed with baseball games, and now in the spring with the sequence of parties and dances leading up to graduation, and it all seemed quaint. I liked sitting with my old friends and listening to them talk, but they were talking about had nothing to do with me. Eva suggested I come out. She found an apartment for me near the university district. She said I would have to find a job or something in order to pay the rent, but I had to have my own place. "But what about the help with the baby?" "We'll figure it out," Eva said. "I don't think it works having you in the house with Jim and me. You've been a wonderful guest." She took me to the apartment, and I couldn't believe I would have my very own place. Already Jim had moved a few pieces of furniture there, old things I didn't need. He wasn't there. I could tell from Eva's careful expression that I couldn't ask about him. Eva said to me, "Good luck," and shook my hand and left me alone. I had a door I could lock. I slept there the first night. I woke in the middle of the night imagining that a sailor was sitting in the corner. I could hear sounds outside in the street. In the morning I dressed and walked down the block and came to a boulevard filled with used bookstores. A cat languished in one window. People played music. Kids sat on one of the walls and smoked, and then beyond that there was the campus where I would go after the summer. I walked across the campus and thought about that maybe I would see Rethke. Maybe he would be somewhere teaching people to write poetry. The campus was filled with wild plants, huge rhododendrons and gigantic trees that I couldn't even see the tops of unless I stopped and stared right into the sky. Nothing had happened in my life to make me what I was, and yet I was a person, even if people like Jem and Eva didn't know what to do with me, besides doing what any drunk sailor would do, which was to make me do things for them. They didn't want me to hear what I had to say or what I had to think. They liked an audience. I wondered if I could draw or paint or write or do something that anyone would be interested in. I had this image of myself as one of those portrait artists down by the waterfront painting people who stopped. Everyone was interested in their own portrait. Walking through the campus with its view of Mount Rainier and the distant choppy water on Lake Washington and the Cascade Mountains, I wondered why the school had been built to look the way it did. It looked the way a college campus was supposed to look, and this made me suspicious. There were Gothic buildings, lead-paned glass, a general Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard pistache. It looked real enough, but the overall effect was chintzy and put on. I could pretend to be anywhere. The view was the one thing that wrecked the illusion that there was some real institution of higher learning. It occurred to me, I could see Rethke if he was here. I could find out where he was and go to his class. I went to the library and found a map and asked where I could find the English department. An old woman at the department said Rethke taught class on Tuesdays and Thursdays in 2:30 in Denny, room 213. I would skip school the next day to see him. That night I found a job waiting tables. I read books in my apartment and drew pictures at the Formica table. In the morning, I caught the bus to school, though. I didn't want to return. Jim paid no attention to me during class. I left school at noon and took the bus back to Seattle and went to stand outside room 213. I stood in the hallway and looked at the students arrive one by one. They came in and looked out the window. They leaned on the desks. They smoked and chatted. 2:30 came and went. No one resembling a teacher came. At 2:45, a thick-set man, not fat exactly, but fleshy and dripping with sweat, his tie flung over one shoulder, rushed up to the door. He paused to breathe in heavily, and then he blanched when he saw the students in the room. He looked at me standing in the hallway. Do you need help?" he asked me. He kept trying to catch his breath. "I'm going to be a student here in the autumn," I said. "You need help, but that is beyond my powers," he said. "I think a handful of reputable universities are still accepting applications. You'll need to make haste." He seemed perfectly happy standing in the hallway. He was a man with freely wandering eyes. He looked at me from head to chest, and that seemed to calm him down. "Are you a teacher?" I asked. "I'm the professor," he said. He seemed glad that I had asked because he reached for the door. "But I don't teach." He threw open the door. "Class," he hollered with a deep-throated burst, and launched into some speech as the door closed. I watched him through the glass in the door where it seemed safer, although the class appeared unmoved by his shout. He glanced back at me to confirm the effectiveness of his entrance. After he turned, I left the musty school building with the marble steps to where I could feel the wind racing over Lake Washington and through the two tall pine trees. What did he mean, "I don't teach"? Wasn't that the job of a teacher, to tell students what to do? Everyone wanted me to do what he said. I realized I didn't know what I wanted to do myself, but I would do something. That's my voice. Thank you very much.